Have you ever been looked straight in the eyes and known without a doubt that they didn't actually see you? Not because you lacked ability, not because you hadn't tried hard enough, but simply because your skin, your gender, or your background didn't fit the mold of the seat they were determined to keep for themselves. That feeling's like standing at a door slightly ajar, only to have a cold hand from inside push you back out. Painful, humiliating, and deeper still, a silent rage. But what happens when the very person shoved aside turns out to be the only one holding the key that can shatter the entire wall of power? What happens when, while they laughed and dismissed her, she was quietly preparing a move so sharp it could shake their empire to its core? This is not just the story of a black woman CEO denied a promotion by an all-white board. This is the story of silent power, where a single gaze can still an entire room, where a single file can bring an untouchable dynasty to its knees. The pain of rejection became her fuel, and the hunger for justice, the hunger to break invisible chains, turned a moment of humiliation into an exposure like no other. If you've ever felt belittled, overlooked, or dismissed, you'll see yourself in every beat of the story. And if you've ever longed to witness the moment justice arrives, silent yet razor sharp, stay with me, because what you're about to hear will make your heart ache and rejoice all at once. Before we begin, if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell. Because every click you make is another heartbeat echoing for those who were pushed outside the door. And now, let's open that door together, where Vivian Clark, the black CEO they thought they could easily cast aside, is about to show them what it looks like when a dynasty collapses from within. Vivian Clark drew in a deep breath before stepping into the gleaming tower. Sheets of glass caught the sun and threw it back in blinding brilliance, making the building look like a fortress of light. But inside, she knew, lurked the same cold shadows she had faced her whole life. The echo of her heels on the marble floor beat like a steady drum. Measured, determined, but betraying the tension inside her chest. This was no ordinary meeting. This was the day the board would vote on the leadership role she had fought for over the past 10 years. She wore a dark, tailored suit, as sharp as the ones draped over the men who had long treated themselves as the definition of power. Every step she took carried not just her own hope, but the invisible weight of countless others like her. Those who had been pushed aside because their skin did not fit the chair of authority. At the end of the corridor, the boardroom door loomed, heavy, ornate, trimmed in gleaming brass. Just as her hand touched the handle, a syrupy voice cut through the air. Excuse me, this meeting is for senior members only. I think you might be in the wrong room." Vivian turned. A young assistant stood there, blonde hair slicked back, face fixed with a polite smile. His eyes swept her from head to toe, lingering just long enough to measure whether she belonged. In that instant, memories crashed in. Moments she had been mistaken for event staff, her name mispronounced on reports, her labor turned into someone else's ladder. All of it condensed into one sentence. "You're in the wrong room." Vivian said nothing. From her bag, she pulled a white envelope stamped in red and signed by the chairman himself. Without a word, she held it out. The assistant's smile faltered. His hand trembled as he took the envelope, only to thrust it back quickly as though he had touched fire. The corridor went silent. Only Vivian's heels echoed now, louder, surer, like the opening drumbeat of a play whose ending no one could yet predict. She pushed open the door. The boardroom glowed under the chandelier, thick with the air of power and arrogance. But from the moment she entered, Vivian showed she did not need permission to exist there. She did not walk in as a guest. She walked in as a truth that could not be denied. What the board did not yet know was this. The very door they tried to guard would become the passageway to their own undoing. They thought they had humiliated her at the threshold, but they had only planted the seed of a storm that was already beginning to form. Vivian stood tall, her hand still on the door. That voice, soft, but sharp as a hidden blade, hovered behind her. The young assistant hadn't softened. His eyes gleamed with challenge. He knew exactly who she was, yet still treated her like an intruder. An extra shadow in a hallway that wasn't meant for her. "You don't have the right to enter," he said, each word deliberate, his false smile unbroken. "This is for selected members only. Not everyone is allowed in." Vivian locked her eyes on his, her silence cutting sharper than any retort. That silence forced him to swallow his words, and the flicker of unease on his face betrayed him. She knew his type well, trained to cloak exclusion and courtesy, to turn discrimination into habit as natural as breathing. Instead of arguing, Vivian slipped the envelope back into his hand. Inside was the official invitation, its red seal undeniable. No explanation, no further glance. His smile vanished. His eyes darted across the letter, his hand trembling as if caught in the act. He returned it in a hurry, unable to hold it. The hallway fell still. Staff passing by averted their eyes, but the tension drew a circle around the two of them. Vivian slid the envelope back into her bag and turned, her faint smile less joy than a silent verdict. She did not need to shout to prove she belonged. The more they denied her, the more undeniable she became. The assistant stood frozen, lips moving but voiceless. His arrogance had devoured him whole. Vivian opened the door and stepped inside, her heels striking like a challenge. She knew this was just the opening act. If the doorway was a trap, then the boardroom beyond would be the battlefield. But Vivian was no cast-out weakling. She entered as someone who had learned. Sometimes silence is the loudest thunder. They thought they had broken her on the steps, but they had only sown the seed of a storm quietly gathering strength. The chandelier bathed the room in brilliance as Vivian entered. White leather chairs sat in a circle like an arena where power was traded in nods and half-laughs. 12 faces turned to her at once, cold eyes scanning her like a trespasser in their sanctum. Vivian said nothing. She moved to her seat, placed her bag on the table, and sat tall. The room froze. They expected her to explain, to plead, at least to ask permission. Instead, she gave them silence. That same sealed envelope had already stopped the first attempt to keep her out. Her calmness now stopped them again. For a moment, their cold eyes faltered. Her silence was no submission. It was proof. She was not here by favor. She was here because truth cannot be denied. A man across the table, silver hair neatly combed, leaned forward, voice dripping with mockery. "Oh, Vivian, what a surprise to see you here. I thought this wasn't supposed to be your business today." A ripple of low laughter cut through the air like clashing blades. Vivian lifted her gaze, lips curving into the faintest of smiles. "Indeed, full of surprises," she said, her voice low, clipped, sharp enough to slice through their laughter. The smirk slipped from more than one face. Because at the very moment they thought they had cornered her, her very presence had turned into a razor-edged mockery of their own arrogance. She needed no outburst. Her silence, her being there, was resistance enough. The chandelier light fell across her features, etching every proud line. While they schemed and measured, she sat still, hands folded neatly before her like a silent declaration. "I don't need your permission. I am here, and I will remain." They could try every trick to deny her, but this moment had already proved one truth. Real power is not in hollow laughter around a table. It is in the icy calm that can freeze an entire room. They thought they had broken her on the steps, but they had only sown the seed of a storm, quietly gathering strength. Vivian pulled out her chair and sat down, back straight, gaze steady. She knew exactly what those stares meant. 12 white faces forming a circle around the polished table, an invisible wall rising between her and them. They didn't need to speak. Their eyes alone delivered the message. She was an outsider trespassing on their dominion. In that moment, she felt the stark divide between the color of the chairs, the color of her skin, and the color of power itself. The white leather gleamed under the chandelier, cold and pristine, and she the only dark point in a ring of manufactured brightness, But instead of shrinking, she rested her hand lightly on the table, a quiet reminder that her presence was not an accident. The air grew heavy. A man at the far end, silver-haired and immaculate in a gray suit, rose to speak. His voice boomed with authority as he unveiled what he called a new vision. Numbers, projections, bold strategies spilled from his lips. The room responded at once, nodding heads, approving smiles, a smattering of applause, as though they were witnessing genius unfold. Vivian didn't need notes. Every word, every chart, every so-called idea was already burned into her memory, because it was hers. The vision he paraded was the very plan she had written. Every analysis, every diagram, the product of sleepless nights and relentless labor. And now, dressed in his voice, it stood before them as his triumph. A familiar ache twisted inside her. This wasn't the first time her work had been stolen, paraded as someone else's brilliance. The play was old, but the actors never tired of performing it. Only this time, they dared to stage it right in front of her, barefaced, shameless. She drew in a slow breath as the applause swelled. The silver-haired man's grin widened, and his eyes flicked to hers, waiting, daring, wanting to see her flinch. His glance carried a message sharper than any word. Here, your labor is just fuel for our ascent. Vivian tilted her head and opened the notebook before her. On the page, lit clean by the chandelier, sat his own signature beneath the title, Approved for Implementation, Vivian Clark's Strategic Plan, a blade hidden in plain sight. But she did not expose him. Not yet. Instead, she let the page rest half open, the inked signature glinting in the light. A few curious glances caught it, paused, then quickly looked away. That silence, that quick dismissal spoke louder than confession. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. It was not the smile of someone robbed. It was the smile of someone waiting for the right cue to drag the whole performance down. The silver-haired man straightened, voice ringing louder, his hand slapping down a stack of papers. Ladies and gentlemen, here it is. Our bold new strategy, the path to a future of unmatched growth. Applause rippled again, louder this time, chairs shifting in excitement. Vivian's quiet page turn cut through the noise, its crisp rustle mocking the spectacle. Every chart, every timeline, every projection he claimed as his vision stared back at her from her notes, word for word. He finished to laughter and praise. One woman leaned forward, eyes shining. Brilliant, just brilliant, exactly what we need. Another added, remarkable foresight, truly original. Their laughter spread like wildfire, filling the room with false celebration. Vivian remained still, the calm at the eye of their storm. A few eyes flicked toward her, probing, testing, waiting for a reaction. But her face was carved from composure, and that unsettled them more than rage ever could. Her hand hovered near her open notebook, the man's signature glaring from the page like a confession no one dared read aloud. One flick of her wrist could expose it all, but she chose restraint. Truth, dropped too soon, would be dismissed as protest, but truth, left to ripen, would strike as a verdict. The man sat down, smugness etched deep into his grin. He thought he had built another rung on his ladder, blind to the fact that every rung rested on her foundation. Vivian folded the notebook shut with a deliberate slowness. To the keen-eyed, it was no idle gesture. It was a drumbeat announcing an act yet to come. The room rang with laughter and approval. Only Vivian sat still, the lone spectator who knew the play would not end as scripted. Vivian was in no rush. While they clapped and praised their thief, she reopened her notebook, tilting the page toward the chandelier. His neat blue signature glistened beneath the title. A few more pairs of eyes caught it this time, stiffened, then quickly looked away. Avoidance louder than admission. The silver-haired man, still basking, had no idea he sat on his own trap. Each word he added rang hollower, echoing against the silent evidence that lay just inches from her hand. Vivian leaned back, closing the book with a sound as soft as a coffin lid sealing. No one needed it explained. They could feel what was buried inside. Let them cheer. Let them heap false laurels on their chosen hero. Her smile told another story. Not of defeat, but of certainty. Certainty that the sharpest blade was already hers. The satire was wordless. It lived in her restraint, in her patience, in her decision to let the farce run its course. Because when the curtain fell, applause would not be for the man on stage. It would be for the reveal that shattered the stage beneath him. A board member shifted uneasily, tugging at his tie, looking anywhere but at Vivian's eyes. The silence she created was a trap, subtle and suffocating. Vivian didn't hurry. Truth rushed out too soon. Only sparked debate. Truth ripened, slowly became a blow that ended empires. And that moment was nearing. The lights blazed, the laughter soared, but no one noticed how her silence had bent the air. A storm, unseen, was rising beneath their feet, and when it broke, no one around that table would sit unchanged. The air inside the boardroom shifted when the high-backed chair at the head of the table creaked and slid back. The chairman, silver hair perfectly in place, arrogance still clinging to him like a second skin, rose slowly. The chandelier light danced across his black suit, sculpting him into a statue carved from pride. Every laugh, every whisper, every false note of praise vanished in an instant. The room fell silent, heavy as a courtroom awaiting its verdict. Vivian sat motionless, fingers laced on the polished wood, her eyes fixed on him with a calm intensity. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice broke the silence, deep and deliberate, each word striking like a gavel. "We have discussed, we have weighed, and now it is time for a decisive conclusion." 12 heads nodded in unison, their eyes trained on him as if watching a ritual. But for Vivian, the words carried no suspense. She knew the tune before it played, the melody of exclusion, dressed in courtesy. He paused, then turned his gaze directly on her. "Though your abilities are undeniable," he declared, his voice echoing off the walls, "this position demands a representative face more suitable. Someone who better reflects the image this company must present to the world." No need for further explanation. The insult was wrapped neatly in 2 words. More suitable. They weren't rejecting her achievements. They were rejecting her existence, her skin, her identity. A few members nodded solemnly. Others averted their eyes, hiding behind silence that reeked of complicity. None spoke against it. Because in the language of this board, suitable never meant capable. It meant white. Vivian remained still. A storm surged within, pounding against her ribs. But outwardly her face was stone. Her silence stripped his words of their power, leaving them exposed, brittle like cracks, spidering across a proud wall. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp as a blade piercing through the polished disguise. And then, instead of outrage, she released a single line, voice steady, cold as tempered steel. "Your words will age faster than you think." The board rippled with unease. No one replied, but every mind in the room caught the sting. It was not protest, it was prophecy, laced with irony. The chairman's hand tightened around his chair, but he forced a smile. He believed he had shut a door in her face. He didn't see that, in that very moment, he had opened a fissure beneath his own feet. The silence stretched. No applause, no dissent, just slow, ritualistic nods circling the table. A dance of compliance. Not conviction, but habit. Deference. Preservation of order. Vivian heard each more suitable fall like a stone in cold water. It didn't acknowledge her years of work, her victories, her vision. It only reminded her that what she was, something she neither could nor would change, was their excuse to deny her. One man to her left cleared his throat, reinforcing the verdict. "The chairman is right. We must consider the global image. The choice must reflect what our clients expect." Another chimed in, voice honeyed but hollow. "Yes, in business, image is everything." Each word struck like a pin driven beneath her skin. They didn't bother to mask it. The insult was sugar-coated, but the bitterness was unmistakable. Vivian set her pen down lightly. No one noticed that in that gesture she was marking, recording, every face, every voice, every sidelong glance. This wasn't just a corporate decision. It was a sentence. A declaration that she, a black woman, would never be allowed to sit in that chair, no matter her brilliance. The chairman pressed on, voice solemn, as though delivering a benediction. We must ensure stability. We cannot risk a decision that could endanger our long-term image. In Vivian's mind, a laugh stirred. Silent but sharp. Stability. The word was a mask. What they feared wasn't instability. It was change. It was truth. It was the loss of privileges they had mistaken for merit. She lifted her head, eyes locked on the chairman. No anger, no surrender. Just a stillness deeper than silence, like the calm before a storm. Then, in a low, deliberate tone, she spoke. Perhaps what you call suitable is not what clients need, only what you're afraid to lose. The room froze. Eyes darted, jaws tightened. Her words were a mirror, forcing them to confront the truth they thought buried. The chairman's smile faltered, stiff at the edges. He didn't answer. He couldn't, because any word would betray him. Vivian left the silence to do her work, a silence that bound each man and woman in the room, pressing heavier with every passing second. The chamber, thick with power, was suddenly suffocating with unease. The ritual nods had stilled. Now the air was thick, brittle, waiting. They expected her to falter, to rage, to prove them right, that she wasn't suitable. But she did none of that. She sat tall, hands calm upon the table, gaze unflinching. Her restraint was sharper than defiance. A few shifted in their seats, coughed to break the tension. But the silence she commanded grew heavier, a weight pressing into every corner. Eyes slid away. Only the chairman dared meet her stare, and even he, beneath the curve of his practiced smile, trembled at the gap her words had carved open. Vivian's voice broke the silence once more, quiet, deliberate. Your words will age faster than you think. Not loud, not hurried, but each syllable fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples no one could ignore. A few gasped, a few stilled. They all heard the blade hidden in velvet, not a protest, a prophecy. The chairman forced a brittle laugh. You certainly have a sense of humor, he muttered, his voice thinner now. Vivian's gaze didn't waver. Her faint smile was no amusement. It was a sentence. A warning that his words would not just age, but decay. And when the moment came, he would be buried beneath the truth he tried to deny. The satire wasn't meant to entertain. It was a prophecy, cold and relentless, planting dread in every seat around that table. The room sagged into awkward silence. The scrape of a chair leg, the tap of a pen, mundane sounds now loud, harsh in the oppressive air. They all pretended calm, but inside they knew they had just witnessed something rare. The humiliated refusing to bow, instead rising with a single sentence that unsettled an empire. Vivian leaned back in her chair, eyes locked on the council. She didn't need to win now. All she needed was to plant the seed, and that seed in time would crack their fortress wide open. The undercurrent from Vivian's earlier remark still lingered in the air. The silence stretched so long that the ticking of the wall clock sounded like a gavel striking wood. Then, suddenly, a woman's voice broke through. Soft, lilting, almost like a breeze slipping past a half-open window. She sat opposite Vivian, golden hair cascading over her shoulders, a gentle smile fixed on her lips. Her fingers toyed idly with a jade bracelet, her posture relaxed, as if she were simply trying to dissolve the tension in the room. Vivian, she began, her tone honeyed and smooth. You don't need to feel wounded. The truth is, just being here is already such an honor. Not everyone gets the chance to sit around this table. A ripple of murmurs stirred across the room. A few nodded, smiling faintly as though they had just heard something wise and kind. But beneath that sweet veneer, Vivian recognized the blade hidden deep inside. It wasn't comfort. It was diminishment. A reminder that she should feel grateful simply for being allowed in, and not dare to expect more. Vivian's gaze held steady on the woman. Under the chandelier's glow, that smile looked brittle, painted on too long, stripped of sincerity. Every sugary word was really just another way of saying, know your place. The irony was sharp. The woman hadn't raised her voice, hadn't criticized openly. Instead, she cloaked her dagger in silk, pressing on the idea that Vivian should feel lucky, as if her presence here were a gift, not the hard-earned result of talent, intelligence, and relentless grit. Vivian leaned back slightly, a fleeting smile touching her lips. Not a smile of gratitude, but one that acknowledged the lie. She knew the cruelest cuts rarely came face to face. They slid beneath the table, thin and near invisible, yet sharp enough to draw blood. She didn't answer right away. Her silence let the words hang in the air, rotting slowly without reply. Then, in a voice low and steady, almost like a whisper, she said, "You're right, not everyone gets to sit around this table. Some are here thanks to luck more than talent." The woman's smile froze. Several members shifted in their seats, throats cleared to mask discomfort. The hand turning the jade bracelet stopped mid-motion, as though the trinket itself had been seized by Vivian's words. Vivian fell silent again, letting the weight of her remarks spread across the room. She didn't need volume or fury. A single measured line was enough to twist the hidden knife back toward the one who wielded it. The room seemed to settle again, until the woman leaned in closer, still smiling, her voice lowering into a whisper meant only for Vivian's ears. "You should know your place," she said, her eyes glinting as though confiding a secret. "Not everyone belongs here. Take this as a reward and leave it at that. Don't ask for more." Her tone was gentle, almost sisterly, yet the words cut sharp as glass. It was poison packaged as kindness, granting favor with one hand while locking the door with the other. Vivian heard every syllable and felt the sting of familiarity. All her life she had been fed variations of this same script. Be satisfied with what you have. Don't overstep. This is already more than you deserve. Different phrases, same message. Power does not belong to you. She let the toxic sweetness pass, unflinching. The cruelty here wasn't loud or immediate. It was the slow bleed of quiet dismissal, meant to tame ambition by suffocating it gently. But today, Vivian had no intention of being the obedient audience. She tilted her head, lips curving in the faintest smile. Her reply came measured, deliberate, enough for the whole room to hear. "You're right, not everyone belongs here. But I believe some are seated here not because they earned it, only because someone else gave up their chair." The air thickened. The woman's friendly mask cracked, her eyes flickering with unease. A cough from one side, averted gazes from another. The sentence had sliced open what everyone knew, but none dared to name. Vivian didn't need to press further. Her silence did the rest, forcing each face at the table to confront their reflection. Behind polished leather seats and gleaming wood, the truth echoed. Not all of them had earned their place. Her smile lingered, not as victory, but as a subtle signal. She had heard, endured, and now returned each hidden blade with precision. The fluorescent light hummed above, its faint buzz suddenly loud against the suffocating quiet. The woman opposite still wore her smile, but her lips trembled now, the gloss of ease stripped bare. Her hand clenched around the bracelet, no longer spinning it, just holding, tense and rigid. Vivian leaned forward slightly, her voice smooth, measured, carrying enough weight for all to hear. "You're right, some people sit here because of luck, not because of talent." The line dropped like a pebble in still water, but its echo rang like a bell. Eyes darted downward, breaths caught. And though the woman forced a shaky laugh, her mask had already fractured. Vivian didn't add more. Her silence sharpened the moment, turning the woman's protest into a confession. Everyone in that room recognized the truth, though no one dared defend her. The boardroom had become a battlefield, not of shouted words, but of glances, pauses, and the heavy weight of exposed hypocrisy. Vivian reclined once more, fingers interlaced, allowing silence to deliver the final blow. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to accuse. One line was enough to strip their masks, honed by years of privilege, and reveal the fragile truth beneath. And in that moment, the knives hidden under the table had turned back on their owners. They were the ones bleeding now, not her. The clock on the wall ticked dryly, marking the shift in the air. The tension stretched tight as a string about to snap, until the chairman cleared his throat and gestured with his hand. An aide entered carrying a silver tray, neatly stacked with pre-printed ballots. No one said it outright, but everyone understood. This was the vote to decide the seat Vivian had been aiming for. A silver-haired member near the head of the table took the first ballot, signed swiftly, then folded it. The second followed, then the third. Like a play rehearsed to perfection, each ballot carried the same inevitable conclusion. As the papers made their way around the table, they delivered a message without a single word. Every vote was against Vivian. She sat still, watching. Her cold eyes followed every hand as it reached for the pen. She didn't need to read the words. She already knew. These ballots weren't choices, they were sentences. A verdict written long before she had ever walked into the room. In her head, a bitter laugh echoed. They called this democracy. Yet those neatly stacked slips were nothing more than daggers tucked up sleeves, waiting for the moment to strike. One younger member, still unsure of himself, glanced at her briefly before signing. His eyes wavered for a heartbeat, then dropped, his pen scratching awkwardly, betraying his own denial. That moment said more than words ever could. They weren't against her out of conviction, they were against her out of fear. When the tray returned to the head of the table, the chairman adjusted his glasses and declared firmly, "It is settled. The council is in agreement." He didn't even need to open the ballots. Everyone already knew the script. Vivian inhaled slowly, her gaze fixed on the folded papers. They sat harmless on the table, yet they were living proof of a dirty game. These ballots weren't just meant to reject her, they were meant to erase her, to render her invisible in the very place she had built her success. But instead of letting that sentence fall on her, Vivian lifted her chin slightly, locking eyes with the chairman. She didn't need to rush. She knew that even the weakest piece could become the decisive one if moved at the right moment. In the silence, a thin smile curved at her lips. Not the smile of defeat, but of someone who had already seen the flaw in the board. That smile alone made a few members shift uncomfortably, as if they had just realized they'd played the wrong move. The silver tray was placed neatly in the center of the table. The chairman gathered the ballots with the gleam of victory in his eyes. He opened the first one, his voice echoing in the dead-still room. Disagree. He opened the second, the third, the fourth. Every single one said the same. Crisp handwriting, uniform words, the same cold verdict. Vivian Clark would not be promoted. When the final ballot was opened, the chairman folded the papers with satisfaction, his tone ringing like a sentence passed. Unanimous. The council is in agreement. This is the collective decision. A few members smiled. Some even clapped softly, as though closing a ceremonial ritual. The artificiality of it only thickened the air. They wanted to turn the act of discarding a person into a legal process, to disguise injustice as the common will. Vivian remained still. The pain wasn't surprise, she had foreseen it. Yet a sting still reverberated, watching hypocrisy be sanctified by neat signatures. Not one dared to oppose. Not one dared to differ. The whole room had bowed, not to reason but to fear and privilege. Collective decision. The phrase dug into her mind, but instead of bowing, she smiled. A thin smile unreadable? Was it acceptance or defiance? She knew one thing. No decision was truly solid if it was built on deceit. Her hand brushed against the leather-bound notebook before her. She opened it, revealing the page filled with signatures. Those same signatures once had endorsed her plan. Proof sat right there on the table, silent but sharp as a blade yet to be drawn. Vivian said nothing. She let the applause fade, let their smugness peak. Because she knew the best moment to expose a lie was not when your opponent was guarded, but when they believed they had already won. The chairman leaned forward, arrogance flickering in his eyes. "You see," he said, his voice calm, almost patronizing. "This isn't personal. This is the collective will. And in a collective, you must learn to accept." Vivian raised her eyes to his, flames flickering quietly behind them. She didn't rebut, but her silence turned his declaration into a cheap joke. They thought they had closed the door with the weight of the collective, but they didn't see the crack their fraud had left behind, a crack that would soon tear open into an unfixable fracture. The claps died down, replaced by smug satisfaction. A few leaned back in their chairs, faces relaxed as though a great task was done. The chairman closed the stack of ballots, placing it on the table with triumph. "That's settled," he declared, final and absolute. But Vivian stayed calm, her gaze steady, the faintest smile lingering. She opened her bag, pulling out a slim folder. She placed it gently on the wooden table. The sound was soft, yet it echoed in the silent room. "How interesting," she said slowly, her voice low but clear enough to make every head lift. "You call this a collective decision." A few frowns appeared. The chairman leaned forward, his tone stiff. "And what exactly are you implying?" Vivian didn't answer. Instead, she opened the folder, revealing pages of fresh, familiar signatures. It was the minutes from a meeting 6 months ago, where these very people had signed their approval of the strategic plan she had created. The chairman's signature lay boldly on the first page, sharp and unmistakable, followed by the signature of the man who had just claimed her work as his own. And then, one by one, every single member around the table. Each line of ink was undeniable proof. They had once agreed, once supported, once recognized her ability. The room froze. Some faces paled, others tried to mask unease by fiddling with pens or clearing throats. But the evidence lay bare on the table. None could deny it. Vivian slid the folder forward, her voice calm. "It seems the council's memory is very short-lived." A nervous laugh escaped from one corner only to die quickly. Her words were a blade wrapped in velvet, cutting deep without needing force. The chairman gripped the arms of his chair, his eyes darkening. He forced his voice steady. "Old records do not reflect present circumstances. We have reconsidered and—" Vivian cut him off, her tone level. "Ah, so the collective will has an expiration date." A heavy silence crashed down. This time, no one dared echo him. Eyes dropped to the table, avoiding hers. The ballots, this so-called collective decision, suddenly looked like cheap props when placed beside those past signatures. Vivian sat tall, her gaze sweeping the room, sharp as glass. She didn't need to add more. One simple gesture had turned their vote into a stain. The air in the room thickened, as if every particle had been crushed beneath the weight of truth. The cold stares that once pinned Vivian down now faltered, slipping into avoidance. A few lowered their eyes to shuffle papers. Others toyed with their pens, desperate to mask the shame flickering across their faces. Yet even in their unraveling, they clung to their fortress of power. The chairman leaned back, exhaled slowly, and adjusted his tone, forcing authority back into his voice. "Mrs. Clark," he began, deliberate and measured, "in business there are things that cannot rest forever on old paperwork. The council's decisions are rooted in the present, and you must learn to respect that." It sounded like a lecture, but beneath it was the desperate attempt to reclaim the upper hand. He wanted to reduce Vivian's evidence to dust, expired, irrelevant before the authority of the collective. A few nodded dutifully, lending him fragile support. A younger man added quickly, "Yes, no one denies your competence, but leadership isn't only about competence, it's about the right image." His words replayed the same tired refrain, as though repeating it would make it true. Vivian's eyes gleamed with a knowing smile. She didn't argue, for she understood. Every excuse now only exposed more fear. They were pretending to hold control, but each word unraveled like loose threads from a torn garment. The room grew heavy, tense, unsteady, like a boat tilting on the edge of capsizing. Every member felt how fragile the balance had become, how easily it could collapse with the slightest push. And Vivian, calm and steady, was the one holding the arrow aimed straight at their thin facade. She sat upright, fingers interlaced on the table, her gaze sweeping across each face, lingering long enough for every person to feel pierced. No one knew what she would do next. yet the waiting itself already cost them their grip on control. Vivian leaned forward slightly, her voice low and deliberate, each word dropping like a stone. If you want to talk about the present, then perhaps I should show you what the present really looks like. The table froze. A few shuddered faintly as though they had just heard the faint crack of a wall about to collapse. The chairman's brow twitched, his eyes darkening. He said nothing, but the smug smile that usually guarded his face had vanished. Vivian didn't rush. She knew they were grasping desperately at the frayed fabric of their confidence. And the more they clung, the closer they came to snapping. The moment her words fell, the room tightened like a drum. But before she could continue, a man blurted out hastily, his voice unusually sharp. "I think that's enough. We've made our decision. There's no need to drag this on." Another tapped his fingers against the table, signaling agreement. "Yes, Chairman, I believe we shouldn't waste more time. Let's conclude here." The chairman tilted his head slightly, relief flickering across his eyes like a man who had just spotted an escape route. He rapped the table lightly, his voice crisp and commanding. "The matter is settled. The council's decision stands. This meeting is adjourned." Nods rippled around the table, spreading like a weak wave. They didn't want to hear more. They didn't want to be dragged into whatever Vivian was still holding back. Their haste was not just arrogance, it was fear of exposure. Vivian saw it all. Every hurried glance, every throat cleared, every hand twitching with impatience. The same people who had laughed while stripping her of credit now flinched at the thought of what she might reveal. A woman at the far end spoke softly, her voice sugary but trembling. "Vivian, you must understand. Not everything requires confrontation. Sometimes silence is the wiser choice." Her words disguised as advice, but in truth it was a warning. Stop now or destroy yourself. Vivian leaned back slowly, her fingers tapping a steady rhythm on the table. She let them talk, let them expose their own panic. The ropes they thought they were tightening around her were in fact tightening around themselves. As the chairman lifted the bundle of ballots preparing to strike the gavel, Vivian tilted her head, a faint smile brushing her lips. Her voice cut clean through the air. "It seems you fear hearing the truth more than you fear failure." The gavel in his hand froze midair. For the first time, uncertainty broke through the mask of power on his face. Several members stiffened, their hands stilled, their eyes refusing to meet hers. Vivian didn't rush. She knew this, their eagerness to end the meeting was the strongest proof of their fear. And once fear surfaced, power slipped from their grip. The silence thickened, suffocating. Everyone waited for the chairman to bring down the gavel, but his hand hovered, suspended, too hesitant to strike. Vivian leaned forward, her eyes sharp as blades. She knew this was the moment to force open the door they had tried so hard to slam shut. In the stillness, she placed both hands on her leather bag. Her movement slow, deliberate, like a ritual more solemn than their vote. No one blinked. The chairman's hand still hovered over the gavel, but his eyes were locked on her. Vivian opened the bag and drew out a thick folder, its plain black cover catching the chandelier's light. She set it down with a sharp thud against the wood, louder, more final than any gavel. "You said you wanted to talk about the present." Vivian's voice rang steady. "Then here it is." She opened the folder. Pages gleamed under the light. Numbers, charts, words in bold ink. First came the financial report, a trail of suspicious transactions funneled into offshore accounts. Red circles marked millions siphoned from company funds under the guise of consulting fees. Next, she unfolded printed emails. Black letters on white paper. Insults. Dismissive remarks about a face that doesn't represent the brand. Racist words written when they believed no one outside this room would ever see them. Now exposed, each word cracked against their wall of power like a whip. A few members blanched. One lunged forward to snatch the page, but Vivian pulled it back smoothly, her calm gaze fixed on him like one might watch a fish thrashing helplessly in a net. "This isn't all," she continued, flipping further. Contracts surfaced, shady deals disguised as partnerships for growth. In truth, nothing more than channels for personal gain. Stamps and signatures stared back at them, undeniable and damning. The room sank into a storm of silence. Not a voice dared rise. The chairman lowered his hand from the gavel, sweat beading on his brow. The man who had parroted her strategy as his own now stared at the floor, pale as chalk. The woman who had whispered warnings twirled her ring, her fingers trembling until the stone clicked nervously against the table. Vivian's gaze swept the room, cold and unflinching. "This," she said slowly, "is what you tried to bury. You call it a collective decision. But this collective is nothing more than a mask." Her voice never rose. She didn't need to shout. The truth once laid bare was sharper than any blade, piercing straight into the heart of those who had thought themselves untouchable. Just one thin folder placed on the table, and the room that once brimmed with cold arrogance shattered like glass, slammed onto stone. Chairs scraped harshly, pens clattered, and then came the voices, overlapping, jagged, cracking under panic. "You signed that contract, not me!" A gray-haired man barked, his face flushed crimson. "Don't you dare accuse me! You're the one who pushed that deal into this meeting." Another slammed the table, sending papers scattering. Those who once nodded obediently in rhythm with the chairman now turned on each other, clawing to shake off blame. Each denial, each counterattack was like a brick hurled in desperation, trying to build a crumbling wall of defense. The chairman banged the table, straining to claw back control, but his voice drowned in the chaos. "Silence! All of you, silence!" he shouted, but his trembling hand betrayed the collapse of his command. The woman with the jade bracelet, the one who had whispered to Vivian to know her place, now clutched the arm of her colleague, her voice cracking. "You promised me that contract would never see daylight. And now what?" The arguments ricocheted off the walls, a discordant symphony of fear. They, the self-proclaimed pillars of the company, were nothing more than a pack of frantic animals, tearing into each other to survive. And at the center of it all, Vivian sat still. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to defend herself. Her hands were calmly folded on the table, her gaze steady, unflinching. In the chaos, her silence carried a weight heavier than all their voices combined. It was the anchor that kept the ship from capsizing, yet also the stone that reminded them there was no escape. A few eyes stumbled onto hers, then quickly darted away. Because in Vivian's eyes they saw something terrifying. Serenity. A kind of power that didn't need to raise its voice, yet could break the spine of the old order. Vivian tilted her head slightly as though listening to a dreadful orchestra. The shouting, the blame, the frantic breaths, all fused into a single sound, the sound of collapse. She didn't smile. She didn't pity. Her silence wasn't withdrawal, it was a declaration. Real power doesn't come from speaking louder. It comes from not needing to speak at all. For a moment, the shouting carried on. But as they looked at her sitting so calmly, they began to see themselves, small, disordered, and pathetically exposed. Desperate for an escape, some began pointing their weapons at her. A broad man, face once beaming at press conferences, now flushed and trembling, tried to roar above his own fear. "Ms. Clark, do you realize leaking these documents is a crime? You could be sued, your career destroyed overnight." But his voice rang hollow like a drum in a room stripped of gravity. No one echoed him. No one backed him. Even he knew his threat was nothing but a frayed rope tossed into the dark. Another voice, shrill and desperate, cut in. "You're digging your own grave, Vivian. Do you really think you can stand against this entire board? Do you think the public will believe you, not us?" But her hands under the table trembled, betraying the words. What came out wasn't a threat. It was a plea. Vivian didn't blink. Her silence made their threats collapse into shards of glass on the floor. A younger member, taut with nerves, slammed his hand so hard papers flew into the air. "You don't even know your place. Here, you are nothing." But his voice cracked halfway, snapping like a string pulled too tight. Vivian only tilted her head, a faint curve forming on her lips. Not mockery, but the look of someone listening to a badly played song. That tiny smile sliced deeper than any insult, and the man slumped back, shoulders folding like a broken beam. Once again, her silence became a mirror. No rebuttal, no weapon. Their trembling voices, their distorted words, turned them into clowns of their own making. No one dared meet her gaze for long. The longer they looked, the smaller they felt. Their threats sounded less like power and more like parody, and in that suffocating air, power shifted. Silent, irreversible. Vivian sat tall, hands steady on the table. Without a single raised word, she had turned the silence into an invisible blade, slicing through their pride. The argument still rang, but no longer with authority. They sounded like the cries of animals in a trap. The louder they screamed, the more their desperation bled through. Vivian remained, still, unmoved, her eyes calm as a lake without ripples. In a storm of noise, her silence thundered the loudest. They glanced at her, waiting for her to erupt, to argue, to defend, but she did nothing, and that nothing terrified them more than any strike. Because when someone remains calm in a storm, you never know what weapon they hold, and not knowing, that was the terror. The chairman, face flushed as though strangled, finally broke. Enough, this ends here. No one outside this room must ever know what happened today. But his voice shook, fractured, more like a plea than an order. Another member chimed in, his voice hoarse. Vivian, think about your career. Don't turn this into a scandal. You'll gain nothing from it. The words fell flat. Everyone knew Vivian was no longer playing for a promotion. She had dragged the entire board into exposure. Silence followed, heavy, deafening, and yet it roared louder than thunder. They looked at each other, faces pale, eyes darting, sweat dripping down their foreheads. Every trembling hand, every restless breath, every flick of the pen. All silent confessions without a single word spoken. Vivian said nothing. But through their panic, their stuttering, their fear, they spoke for her. They wrote her indictment for them all. In that room, power had changed hands. It no longer belonged to the men in suits or the women in jewels. It belonged to the silence of the woman they had tried to erase. Vivian adjusted her posture slightly, her gaze unbroken. She didn't need to declare victory. She didn't need to conclude. Her silence had already spoken. And they, the ones who once ruled, could only bow their heads before a nameless power they could neither measure nor resist. The room that once stood rigid as a fortress now crumbled into an invisible ruin. The gleaming leather chairs, always occupied by confident, arrogant faces, had become stark proof of a truth no one wanted to admit. Power is never eternal. The man who used to open meetings with grandiose speeches was the first to rise. His suit remained pressed, his tie knotted tightly, but his trembling hands couldn't even grip his briefcase. The echo of his shoes across the marble floor rang hollow, the same sound that had greeted Vivian when she first entered. Except now it was not a welcome. It was retreat. Next came the woman famed for her smile sharp as a blade. Earlier she had whispered to Vivian, "Not everyone deserves a seat here." Now it was she who lowered her head, avoiding every eye as she slipped away. What once sounded like a threat now replayed in her mind as a knife turned inward. Empty seats appeared one by one, forming strange gaps. A room once meticulously ordered, where every chair was a symbol of power, now revealed gaping voids. Each abandoned seat was a crack in the fortress, and no plaster could ever seal them again. Vivian remained seated. She neither rushed their exit nor smirked at their downfall. She simply sat, silent as though every step, every unraveling had been scripted long ago, and she alone knew the ending. That quiet composure only made their departure more frantic, like thieves fleeing a house they once called their own. A few lingered, but their eyes wandered, lost like birds separated from the flock. They no longer sat upright, no longer dared to speak with certainty. Vivian's silence had subdued them all. What remained was a room heavy with abandoned chairs, fading shadows, and an air thick as ashes. The image would haunt them, the building once a fortress now turned into its own courtroom. No gavel was needed, no verdict spoken. They had sentenced themselves. Vivian's gaze shifted from the void before her. In her eyes was no triumph, only calm certainty. No fortress built on lies can stand forever. She rose and stepped through the heavy wooden doors. The long corridor stretched ahead, lit coldly by fluorescent lights, each echo of her heels measuring resolve. Every step carried her further from the suffocating chamber, closer to the light of a new battle. At the far end, a young man in a wrinkled shirt clutched a recorder in his hand, waiting. He wasn't hardened like seasoned reporters. His eyes blazed as if he had caught the scent of an explosion. The moment Vivian drew near, he asked without pleasantries, "You won, didn't you?" The question cut through the corridor like a blade. It wasn't small talk, nor cautious probing. It was a demand. Confirm it. Declare it. Own it. He wanted the words from her lips, words that would crown tomorrow's headline. Vivian halted. For a breath, the entire hallway seemed to stop. The young reporter's eyes shone, eager for the spectacle of victory. But he didn't yet understand. Vivian's triumph wasn't a headline. It wasn't a chair left empty. It was deeper, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head, her gaze piercing him as if to ask, "Do you really think victory is just about sitting in a chair?" Despite his youth, a chill crept down the reporter's spine. Her silence made his question feel clumsy, almost childish. At last she smiled faintly, so slight no one could tell if it was warm or mocking. Then she replied slowly, "Win? They lost on their own." The words struck like a hammer. No boasting, no self-praise, just the raw truth. With all their schemes, they had only defeated themselves. The reporter froze. He imagined the story, but the words escaped him. There was no celebration, no applause, only silence. And yet that silence spoke louder than any victory speech. Vivian moved on, leaving him rooted to the corridor, grappling with a question bigger than the one he had asked. What does victory truly mean? The glass doors spun shut behind her, and the outside air swept in, sharp, bright, and merciless as noon sun. A small crowd waited on the steps, their eyes a mixture of curiosity and unease. They didn't know what had happened inside, only that whispers said the fortress of power had trembled. Vivian descended the stone steps unhurried, as though each heel strike inscribed a new chapter. The young reporter trailed her, restless, unable to tame his curiosity. He asked again, his voice trembling on the edge of pleading, "So, in the end, did you win?" Vivian paused. The crowd hushed. The wind tugged at her coat, making her look less like an actor leaving a stage and more like the director who had just closed the curtain on a rotting play. She turned, a thin smile at her lips, her voice calm. Not loud, not soft, but resonant enough to feel as though the whole city held its breath. "No, I only pulled back the curtain. The light will do the rest." In that instant, no one breathed. Her words weren't an answer, they were a verdict. No thunder, no gavel, no fury. Just a simple image. A curtain drawn aside, the truth laid bare. Justice doesn't need to scream. It only needs to be exposed, and once revealed, the truth delivers its own sentence. The reporter stood stunned. He realized tomorrow's paper didn't need a sensational headline or triumphant prose. Just one line would suffice. The curtain was lifted, and the light cannot be stopped. Vivian walked on, blending into the city crowd. No one could tell she was the epicenter of a power quake. That was her strength. She didn't need a pedestal, didn't need applause. She only needed the light to do its work. And back in that cold chamber, the empty chairs remained. They weren't just furniture, they were reminders that power borrowed from lies is temporary. When the light pours in, it crumbles faster than the dark. And the audience, those who heard this story, shivered. They understood. Justice doesn't need swords nor shouts. Justice only needs to be exposed. And when the truth stands uncovered, an entire empire of deceit collapses in its own silence. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.